The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Elena Martinez clocked in at Cedar Creek Medical, her name badge clicking against the stainless steel of the time clock at 6:44 a.m. 3 years. 1,095 shifts. Not once had anyone asked her about the scar that ran from her left wrist to her elbow, white and jagged as a lightning strike, usually hidden under her sleeves. The ICU was already breathing hard, 2 post-ops, 3 critical patients, a dialysis setup in bay for that was running 2 hours behind. She hung her jacket in her locker and touched the folded flag there, triangle of stars pressed against her palm, her fallen medic's blood still a phantom stain that only she could see. Breathe. Focus. 1 shift at a time. The doors to the unit hissed open and the morning chorus began, alarms beeping in discordant rhythm, ventilators wheeze-clicking their mechanical lungs, the overhead intercom crackling with a surgeon's page. Elena moved through the chaos with economical precision. Straight spine. Measured breathing. Eyes reading the monitors the way snipers read windage and distance. She checked the post-op patient in Bay 1 first, scanning the cardiac strip, noting the slight irregularity in his rate, the lab values clipped to his chart showing potassium drifting high. That wasn't luck. That was pattern recognition earned in a field hospital in Tikrit under the sound of rockets. She adjusted his foredrip without being asked, reduced the rate by 0.3 milliliters per minute. The charge nurse, Diane, had been at Cedar Creek for 6 years and noticed none of it. "Elena, you're a lifesaver," Diane said, rushing past with an armload of supplies. Elena didn't respond. Compliments felt dangerous when you were supposed to be invisible. Bay 2 held a woman post-appendectomy, stable vitals, good pain control, dressing dry. Elena checked the site, noted no signs of infection, documented everything with the kind of precision that made other nurses call her careful or lucky. Never competent. Never trained. Never anything that might suggest she knew what she was actually doing. The morning stretched into its rhythm. Vital signs every 2 hours. Labs reviewed. Medications administered with the accuracy of someone who understood that dosage errors killed people. She had held 3 soldiers while their systems shut down from medication mistakes in the field, had felt their hands go slack in hers while she whispered apologies they could no longer hear. Each bag was a second chance to save someone. She didn't waste them. At 9:15 a.m., the trauma alert siren wailed from the lobby, that specific frequency that made the whole unit's energy shift like an animal sensing weather change. Elena's hand steadied. The intercom crackled with a dispatcher's voice, clipped and professional, incoming medevac. Marine, 38, multiple penetrating wounds, IED blast, 2 minutes out. The helicopter. She could hear it already, the rotor wash shaking the windows of the ICU, that particular percussion that lived in her chest. The trauma team mobilized. Dr. Marcus Chen, the resident, started barking orders. "Get me the massive transfusion protocol set up, type O negative, 2 units ready, 6 units of fresh frozen." Elena was already moving toward the blood bank. She knew this dance. She had lived this dance in a tent hospital with canvas walls and the smell of copper and diesel smoke. The medevac doors burst open and the patient arrived on a stretcher, 2 military paramedics moving in perfect synchronization, their uniforms marine utility pattern, their movements economical and trained. The patient's face was visible for just a moment before they transferred him onto the hospital bed. Elena's breath caught. Not visibly. Never visibly. But something in her chest seized and held tight. She knew that face. Commander Robert Hayes. The same officer who had commanded her son Miguel's unit at Camp Lejeune. The same man who had looked her in the eye 6 months ago and promised, "Captain, I will bring your boy home alive." That's not a prediction. That's a Marine's word. Miguel was home. Safe. In his apartment in Savannah, sleeping through the morning like a 22-year-old with nothing left to prove. But Hayes had kept his word. And now he was bleeding through the dressings and his blood pressure was 78/42 and crashing. "What do we have?" Dr. Chen demanded, his voice the sharp pitch of someone trying to sound confident when fear was edging in. The paramedic rattled off the report: blast proximity, right side, shrapnel wounds to the right lower lobe, possible pneumothorax, 2/4 running wide open, conscious but in distress, pain level 8-9, vital signs unstable for transport. Hayes's eyes found Elena's for a fraction of a second. Recognition flashed there, then confusion. What was she doing in this hospital? Why was she here? How was she here? Then agony pulled his attention back to his body's betrayal. Elena moved into position, reading what needed to happen before the orders came. Oxygen saturation dropping. SpO2 at 89 and falling. The chest rise on his right side was shallow, asymmetrical. The breath sounds on the right were absent. That wasn't pneumothorax. That was tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed and was compressing his heart. Every second the pressure built, his blood pressure dropped. His perfusion died. His time got shorter. Dr. Chen wasn't moving fast enough. He was reading the chest X-ray that was still processing, caught in that paralyzing moment where knowledge hadn't yet become action. Elena moved past him toward the supplies. 14-gauge angiocath needle, she said, pulling it from the crash cart. Her voice came out flat, professional, the voice of a very confident nurse about to violate protocol in ways that would haunt her later. She positioned the needle at Hayes's second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her memory from 100 field amputations and emergency decompressions under fire. His crashing, she said to no one in particular. No time to wait. The needle went in. The resistance. Then the hiss. That beautiful, terrifying hiss of air escaping, the pressure releasing, the tension equalizing. Hayes gasped, not a sound of pain but of sudden oxygen reaching his lungs again. His color changed. Pink instead of blue. The monitors started climbing. Oxygen saturation moving from 89 to 91 to 94. His blood pressure rising from 78 to 82 to 88. Stable. Breathing. Alive. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Dr. Chen's face shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like fury. Who authorized that? He asked quietly, and the quiet was worse than shouting would have been. Elena was already moving toward the door, toward the cardiac monitor, toward looking busy, toward making herself invisible again. But it was too late. Dr. Alistair Pierce was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression a sculpture of barely contained rage. He had seen everything. He had watched a nurse perform an emergency procedure without physician approval, without consultation, without the paperwork trail that made such things acceptable in the carefully ordered hierarchy of hospital medicine. His eyes locked with Elena's, and in that moment, the whole balance of the next 6 months was set in motion. He smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. The kind of smile a shark makes before it tastes blood in the water. Nurse Martinez, he said, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. My office. Right now. We need to discuss appropriate scope of practice. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply set down the cardiac monitor lead she was holding and moved past him toward the corridor, her hand still steady, her breathing still measured, every muscle in her body locked down tight around the certainty that Dr. Pierce had just become the most dangerous thing in this hospital, and the terrified thought that Hayes, this man who had promised to bring her son home, might not survive having her try to save him. The Grand Rounds Amphitheater held 80 seats. On this Wednesday morning in March, 53 physicians and medical students filled the tiered rows, coffee cups steaming, attention fractured across laptops and phones. Dr. Pierce stood at the lectern like a conductor before an orchestra, his tailored Italian suit catching the fluorescent glare, his voice modulated to that particular frequency that demanded deference without asking. Elena sat in the back row, her scrub still damp from the 4-hour resuscitation she'd completed 6 hours earlier, her name badge clipped at precisely the same angle it had been for 3 years, her posture the kind of rigid you only learned in a combat zone. Pierce was discussing septic shock protocols, walking through a case presentation with clinical precision, then he pivoted. The shift was subtle but deliberate, like a knife turn in water. This brings me to patient safety concerns, he said, his eyes finding Elena's across the amphitheater. Specifically regarding unauthorized interventions during code situations. "Nurse Martinez, would you stand please?" The room contracted. 52 faces turned. Elena rose without hesitation, without the tremor that might have cracked her composure. Her jaw was granite. Her breathing measured. 2 days ago, during a trauma code, Nurse Martinez performed a needle decompression, a procedure that falls explicitly under emergency medicine physician scope only. Without supervision. Without authorization. Without the basic humility to understand the limits of her training. He paused, letting the silence settle like ash. This is precisely the textbook example of dangerous overreach by undertrained nursing staff. Nurses, please remember, your certifications have limits for a reason. Those limits exist because they keep patients safe. Not because we're trying to control you. Because you could actually kill someone. The laughter started in the front row, 2 residents, a chief fellow, then spreading like a contagion. Nervous laughter. Conformist laughter. The sound of 30 years of hierarchy, of knowing which way the power flowed. Elena stood motionless. She did not look away. She did not flush red. She did not tremble or press her lips together or give him the satisfaction of seeing anything that could be construed as emotion. She simply held his gaze for 5 seconds that stretched like surgical time, each one heavy as a patient's last breath. Then she spoke, her voice level and low enough that the room had to quiet itself to hear her. "The difference between us, doctor, is that my mistakes haunt me in the mirror, yours just get buried in the charts." She turned on her heel, descended the amphitheater steps with measured pace, and walked out through the double doors. Behind her, Pierce's face went the precise purple of infected tissue. The laughter stopped. 78 people sat in absolute silence, understanding in that moment that something had shifted, that they had just witnessed someone refuse to be broken, and that they would have to decide what that meant about their own complicity. He spent the next 48 hours weaponizing every institutional tool available to him. It wasn't loud. Competent predators don't roar, they maneuver. On Friday, Elena approached the break room vending machine at 1,445 hours, a 5-minute window she'd carved out of a 12-hour shift, her shoulders still aching from turning patients, her mind already cataloging the night shift's incoming admissions. Pierce stood there with 3 residents and 2 nurses, blocking the machine like a feudal lord holding court. His voice was pitched to carry. "Ah, our resident cowboy nurse. Tell me, Martinez, do you practice medicine at home too? Maybe some garage surgery on weekends? Appendectomies in the basement?" His audience laughed, quicker this time, more comfortable, buoyed by his authority. Elena's hand moved toward the vending machine's coin slot. She said nothing. Her stare could have frost glass. Pierce continued, his tone dripping honey and arsenic in equal measure, silent treatment. "Very professional, Nurse Nightingale. I bet the patients just love that bedside manner." More laughter. Elena inserted her dollar bills without acknowledgement, selected black coffee, nothing else, because food would require lingering, and lingering would require engagement. The machine whirred and dispensed. She lifted the cup to her lips and walked past all of them toward the corridor. Pierce called after her, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "You know what they call people like you? They call them accidents waiting to happen." She kept walking. Her hand did not shake as it lifted the coffee to her mouth. Her heart rate did not spike beyond what a simple adrenaline flush would produce. But inside the architecture of her ribs, something sharp was turning. 3 years at Cedar Creek Medical. 3 years of keeping her head down, of accepting orders from people half her capability, of watching protocols be written by administrators who'd never seen the inside of a trauma bay. 3 years of being exactly what they needed her to be and still somehow never being enough. The pharmacy encounter came on Saturday night at 2,230 hours. Elena had gone to verify a vancomycin dose for an ICU patient, her mind moving through dosing calculations, through renal function analysis, through the mathematics of infection and immunity. Pierce was there, leaving a note with the pharmacist, his presence like smoke in water. He turned and blocked her approach to the counter with deliberate casualness. "I've been doing some administrative review," he said, his voice quiet enough to seem almost confidential, which made it worse somehow. "I've documented 12 instances of you exceeding your scope. 12. Unauthorized assessments. Diagnostic statements. The way you speak to families, it's frankly bordering on providing medical advice." His finger rose, pointing toward her face, not quite touching but close enough that the air between them seemed to thicken. "One more, Martinez. One more instance, and I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Personally. I don't care if you're in the middle of a code. I don't care if you're saving a life. Scope creep is scope creep, and I will not have this hospital liable because you think you're more than what your RN diploma says you are." His voice had dropped even lower, which meant nobody else could hear, which meant this was not about the 12 documented instances, which meant this was about something deeper and more predatory than policy violations. "You don't get to play doctor just because you watch too much television, nurse. Those days are over." Elena's jaw tightened. The muscle along her temporal line flexed once. But when she spoke, her voice was flat as dead air, as neutral as an EKG baseline. "Are we done here, doctor?" Pierce leaned closer. She could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, the scent of a man who believed his own mythology. "We're done when I say we're done, RN, he said, and the emphasis on the letters, RN, not nurse, not professional, just the credential without the person, hung in the air between them like a gauntlet. Elena held his eyes. Unblinking. Completely still. She stood there with the patience of someone who had waited for extraction in a bombed-out hospital with shrapnel in the walls and no reinforcements for 19 hours. She stood there with the composure of someone who had already survived the worst and found it wanting. Pierce stepped backward first. His jaw clenched. He muttered something about following protocol and moved past her toward the exit, and Elena watched him go with the expression of someone watching a predator slink back into the brush, still dangerous, still hungry, but temporarily retreated. Then, at 03 for 7 hours on Sunday morning, the trauma alert came through. The overhead speaker crackled, medevac trauma incoming. ETA for minutes. IED victim, multiple shrapnel wounds, 2 units blood products already running. Trauma Bay 1, trauma team activate. Elena's blood pressure dropped and flooded back in a single beat. The message repeated. For minutes. IED. Those words meant Kandahar, meant Fallujah, meant the kind of wound she'd treated in the 82nd Airborne Combat Support Hospital in Tikrit when she was Captain Elena Martinez instead of Nurse Elena Martinez, when her hands were moving on instinct born from 317 trauma cases and a photographic memory for arterial anatomy. Her fingers froze on the 4 pump she was adjusting. One of the night nurses, Sarah, 24 years old, 6 months trauma experience, looked at her across the dim ICU. You good? Sarah asked, and Elena nodded once, mechanically, because she could not afford to be anything else. The medevac touched down at 0356 hours. The rotor wash shook the emergency department, a sound that unlocked something in Elena's chest, a response written in muscle memory and blood. She was already moving, already in the trauma bay, already seeing the gurneys roll through with their human cargo. IED blast, multiple lacerations, abdominal shrapnel, one piece working its way through the intercostal muscles, dangerously close to the left atrium. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Reeves, competent and steady, was already barking orders. And then Elena saw his face. Commander Robert Hayes. The Marine who'd promised her son he'd come home alive. The officer who'd led Miguel's unit through 3 deployments and somehow kept him breathing through all of it. His eyes opened for a single moment. Grey eyes. Alert eyes. You, he whispered. His hand reached out, and Elena took it without thinking, protocol submerged beneath something older and deeper. Miguel's mom. You're here. Then his eyes rolled back and his body went rigid and his oxygen saturation began its descent, and Elena was already moving, already performing vitals, already scanning his wounds, already moving with the kind of fluid precision that nobody develops in 3 years of hospital nursing, and somewhere in the equation Dr. Pierce saw that precision, saw the military muscle memory, saw the way her hands moved like they'd been trained for something far beyond bedside care, and his face went very still. Patient conflict of interest, Pierce said. He'd materialized beside Hayes's gurney like smoke. Martinez, you're reassigned. You know this, Commander. Policy 7.3.2. Step back. It wasn't a request. Elena's hands kept moving. She was assessing the shrapnel wound near the heart, her fingers light and clinical and absolutely certain. I'm the senior ICU nurse on shift, Doctor. The policy applies to romantic relationships and family. I'm neither. Her voice was controlled, but her hands trembled with something that wasn't fear, it was restraint, the effort required to stay in protocol when every nerve in her body was screaming to take command of this code, to run the resuscitation herself, to do what she was actually trained to do instead of what her diploma said she could do. Off the case, Pierce said again, and his voice had that cold institutional certainty, that weaponized authority that comes from knowing the hospital bylaws better than the people they're designed to protect. Reassigned to Nurse Shaw. Immediately. He pulled a form from his pocket. He'd prepared this, Elena realized. He'd anticipated that Hayes might come through these doors, that Elena might respond, and he'd already constructed her containment. I'll file the documentation by morning. Elena stepped back. Her hands dropped to her sides. She watched them wheel Hayes to ICU, watched his oxygen saturation continue its decline, watched a nurse with 6 months of experience pick up his chart, and something in her chest simply stopped. At 0600 hours, she pulled up Hayes's chart remotely from a terminal in a supply closet, her fingers moving without conscious intention. Vitals declining. Breathing labored. The junior nurse had missed the pattern of deterioration, had attributed the change to normal post-operative fluctuation instead of seeing it for what it was, the beginning stages of internal bleeding, or cardiac compromise, or the slow inevitable march toward cascade failure. Elena's hand shook as she reached for her phone to call Miguel. Then she stopped. What would she tell him? That the man who saved his life was dying on her watch, just behind an institutional barrier she wasn't permitted to cross. That protocol had become a weapon, that policy had become a cage, that somewhere in the architecture of Dr. Pierce's rules and documentation, her son's father figure was slowly disappearing. She set the phone down on the metal desk. It rattled against the steel. A small sound. But in the silence of the supply closet, it echoed like a gunshot. She didn't belong on the night shift in ICU. That was the understood contract at Cedar Creek Medical. Floor nurses stayed on their assigned units, and Elena Martinez, despite 3 years of perfect evaluations, had been quietly shuffled to the cardiac ward. But Commander Hayes was in room for 12, and Elena had made a promise to a boy in dress blues that she intended to keep. So every 30 minutes, between vitals on her actual patients, she found reasons to walk past his door. The fluorescent glow of his monitors illuminated the hallway in pale blue and green. She paused at the glass, watching his chest rise and fall with the rhythm of the ventilator, mechanical and measured. His oxygen saturation read 94%. Good. Stable. But something in the curve of his breathing worried her, a subtle tension in his intercostal muscles, a tightness that suggested the air moving through his lungs was fighting physics it shouldn't have to fight. The clock read 2,347 hours when she walked past again. O2 sat had drifted to 92%. She stopped. The junior nurse assigned to Hayes's care, a recent graduate named Tyler, was adjusting the flow rate on the ventilator, speaking softly into his phone, distracted. Elena recognized the look, someone checking personal messages while responsible for a critically injured Marine. She didn't judge. She just noted it. That was the difference between civilian nurses and the ones who'd worked under fire in Tikrit. Civilian nurses got distracted. Combat nurses developed a sixth sense for the moment when distraction became a liability. Hayes's shoulder had tensed. His neck had stiffened. The smallest signs, but Elena had seen them before in field hospitals when air trapped in a pleural space began pressurizing against a collapsed lung. Tension pneumothorax wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it killed you while everyone around you was still adjusting the oxygen dial. At 0127 hours, the monitors screamed. 3 distinct alarms in rapid succession, a cascade of sound like someone was playing a video game in the ICU. Elena was moving before conscious thought caught up, abandoning a blood pressure cuff in room for 10, her feet carrying her toward Hayes's room on instinct older than her nursing license. His oxygen saturation had plummeted to 88% and was dropping. 87, 86. His lips had taken on a blue-gray tint, the color of concrete in winter. His trachea was deviating visibly to the left, and the jugular veins in his neck were distending like the strings of a guitar tuned too tight. Tyler stood frozen at the foot of the bed, hands extended as though offering an apology to someone about to slip away. The attending physician was 2 floors down. The on-call resident, Dr. Morrison, a second year who looked like he'd been assembled from worry and uncertainty, arrived at the doorway and stopped, his eyes moving from monitor to patient to monitor again. Muscle memory betraying the neurological pathways that should have known what to do next. Tension pneumothorax, he whispered, the words less diagnosis than prayer. Elena pushed past him into the room. Needle decompression. Now. Or he dies in the next 90 seconds. She was already moving toward the crash cart, her hand steady as surgical steel, pulling the kit before anyone could form the words to stop her. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Get me an 18-gauge angiocath needle. The voice coming from her mouth wasn't the deferential voice that had apologized to Dr. Pierce during grand rounds. It was the voice that had commanded field hospitals in Tikrit when shrapnel fell like rain. It was the voice of someone who had already decided what the next 3 minutes would look like, and her decision was not a request. Tyler moved. That was the power of absolute certainty. It transferred like a current through everyone nearby. Morrison opened his mouth to object, to cite protocol, to remind her that nurses didn't perform procedures requiring surgical certification, and Elena's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. In that second, she wasn't a nurse anymore. She was Captain Elena Martinez, JSOC training, 3 combat tours, 247 lives saved by her hands alone, and she was asking him if he wanted to explain to her son why she let a Marine die because she'd worried about paperwork. Morrison stepped aside. Elena's hands prepped the site with practiced efficiency, iodine swab across his ribs, alcohol to dry it, the needle already loaded and ready. The chest wall stretched taut beneath her fingers, skin over muscle over bone, the anatomy she'd learned in textbooks and relearned in surgical tents in Fallujah and Sanjin and Logar province. She found the anatomical landmarks by feel more than sight, the space between the second and third ribs, the midclavicular line running through his body like an invisible map drawn only for people who knew how to read it. Deep breath, Commander. Just one. Even knowing he couldn't breathe deeply, that the collapsed lung and trapped air had stolen that luxury from him. The needle advanced through his skin, a smooth pressure that told her the caliber was correct, the angle true. She felt the fascial pop as the needle punched through the parietal pleura, and then the hiss. Air escaping like a sigh, like the whole world exhaling at once, like pressure finally finding the mercy of release. The sound lasted maybe 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the monitors changed their song. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 90, 92, 94, 96. His color returned from concrete gray to the flush of actual life. His neck relaxed. The jugular veins flattened. His chest expanded with a breath that actually reached his lungs, and the ventilator confirmed it with numbers and rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Normal sinus rhythm. The most beautiful for words in emergency medicine. Elena secured the catheter, stepping back as Morrison finally found his medical training and moved forward to place the chest tube, the procedure that would keep this from happening again, the follow-up to the emergency she'd just managed to reverse. But the thing Morrison was learning, right there in that moment with his hands shaking and his career potentially collapsing, was that Elena had already saved Hayes's life. Everything Morrison did now was just administrative, necessary, but secondary. Elena was washing her hands at the sink, moving with the calm that came from having already survived the worst, when she heard Tyler's voice, small and uncertain from the doorway. "How did you know that was going to happen?" Because I've seen it before. She didn't turn around. The water ran warm across her hands, washing away the iodine and the memory and the knowledge that Dr. Pierce was going to destroy her for this. That file he'd been building, the one filled with citations and protocol violations and evidence of her dangerous scope creep, had just gotten another page. You'll know it next time too. You watched. I watched you break about 5 hospital policies, Morrison said quietly. His voice had changed. The uncertainty was still there, but it had been supplemented by something Elena recognized as the early stages of respect. I could cite you to administration. You could. Elena dried her hands on a paper towel, her face showing nothing, though inside she was performing a calculation involving career destruction and classified government charges and whether it was possible to lose a job you'd already been promised was gone. But then you'd have to explain why you froze while a patient was dying and a floor nurse performed a life-saving procedure instead. She turned to face him, and her eyes were the color of storm water, calm and absolute. You won't cite me, doctor. You'll go back to your call room and you'll spend 3 hours staring at the ceiling thinking about how close that was. And next time you see a patient decompensate like that, you'll remember what you learned tonight. And what did I learn? That protocol doesn't save lives. Training does. Experience does. And sometimes, she paused, and there was the ghost of something almost like humor in her expression, sometimes you need to get out of the way and let someone who knows what they're doing take the wheel. She walked toward the door, stopping beside Morrison. You'll be a good doctor someday, because you know how to listen. Just remember that part. It'll matter more than you think. She was 4 steps down the hallway when Tyler caught up with her, his voice urgent and low. Elena, they're going to fire you for that. Probably. Her pace didn't change. But Commander Hayes is breathing on his own, and he's going to live to see his daughter get married next spring. That was the choice. I made it. She rounded the corner toward the stairwell, where the evening sounds of the hospital hummed with the particular rhythm of institutional life, the distant beep of monitors, the whisper of vac systems cycling through recycled air, the barely audible murmur of a code team in some other part of the building where someone else was fighting a different war. And that's when the emergency exit door crashed open from the other direction. An orderly she didn't recognize erupted through the threshold, his eyes wide and wrong, his movements jerky with adrenaline or drugs or panic. Behind him came a man in civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket, moving with the kind of predatory purpose that Elena recognized immediately as lethal intent. The knife he held caught the fluorescent light and turned it into something ugly. Elena's brain processed the scene in the time it took to blink, threat assessment, distance calculations, available resources. She was standing approximately 8 feet from Hayes's room. The man with the knife was between her and everything else. Her hands, already moving, were already committed to what her body had already decided. The knife came first. The man came second. He burst through the door in civilian clothes, jeans, grey hoodie, the kind of purposeful stride that registered in Elena's hindbrain before her conscious mind caught the blade. Former military. Discharged. Angry. The tactical assessment took 0.3 of a second, automatic as breathing. Commander Hayes lay vulnerable in the bed, still tethered to monitors, O2 line running, for in the crook of his arm. The man moved with trained economy toward the 4-pole, the knife catching fluorescent light like a mirror flash. Elena didn't think. Her body had already decided. She planted her left boot and pivoted hard, putting herself between the blade and Hayes's bed, not a heroic lunge but a geometric solution. The knife punched into her left shoulder instead of the 4 line, instead of Hayes's exposed neck. The pain was immense and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Adrenaline screamed through her nervous system, flooding her bloodstream with clarity that felt like ice water. She felt the knife twist. She felt the resistance of muscle and bone. She registered the warmth spreading down her left arm as the blade withdrew. The attacker hissed something, a curse, a name, and came at her again. His right hand rose. The second stab was faster, coming from her blind side as she twisted away, and the knife caught her across the ribs, shallow but burning hot, cutting through scrub fabric and skin in a white fire line. That's when she moved. Not the nurse. The captain. Her left elbow drove upward in a marine combative strike she wasn't supposed to know, targeting the triangle of soft tissue under his chin, the carotid and larynx compressed in the narrow space. He went down choking, knife clattering away, gasping for air he couldn't find. Security was through the door 40 seconds later, she knew because the clock on the wall read 22:47 when he entered and 22:48 when he hit the ground. 2 minutes. The entire thing took 2 minutes. They got the attacker into restraints. Savannah PD arrived with their radios crackling. A physician assistant appeared with a trauma tray and started examining Elena's shoulder wound while she stood there dripping blood onto the floor in steady drops. 8 drops on white tile, each one a small red period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Someone found her a chair. Someone else brought ice wrapped in gauze. The shoulder wound needed 14 sutures. The rib wound needed 8 more. The PA, a kid named Martinez, no relation, kept asking if she was in pain while she sat there answering questions about the attacker's trajectory and whether she'd seen his face and whether she knew who he was. She did. Former Corporal David Reeves, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, dishonorably discharged for assaulting a superior officer in 2017. She knew because she'd treated him in field medical during a convoy ambush near Fallujah in 2019, bandaged his leg wound while rounds came in, watched him medevaced out while she stayed behind to stabilize another casualty. He'd blamed her for the leg infection that cost him 50% mobility. He'd blamed her for his discharge. He'd blamed her for Hayes making the decisions that routed him out of active duty. She said none of this to the PA or to the police or to the hospital administrator who appeared in the ER at 0300 looking like he'd swallowed a golf ball. By dawn, she was discharged with aftercare instructions and a prescription for antibiotics. She walked out of the ER at 07:42 wearing yesterday's scrubs with 2 sets of bandages underneath, her left arm in a sling, her ribs wrapped tight enough that breathing felt like negotiating with broken glass. She made it as far as the break room before Dr. Pierce found her. He came through the door at 0815 carrying a manila folder so thick it bent under its own weight. His face had that expression she'd learned to read, the satisfied smile of a predator watching wounded prey try to run. "Incident report," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Filed with administration, legal, and risk management. You violated direct reassignment orders removing you from Commander Hayes' care. You performed procedures outside your nursing certification. You created massive liability exposure by engaging a combatant instead of evacuating to safety." He opened the folder. The pages inside were typewritten, footnoted, meticulously sourced. Hospital Bylaws Section 4.7, Subsection C, Paragraph 3, he read, his voice carrying the rhythm of a man who'd rehearsed this. Staff may not perform medical interventions beyond their licensed scope without direct physician authorization. Section 9.2, Subsection A. Any violation of protocol occurring during direct reassignment constitutes grounds for immediate termination. Elena watched his mouth move. Watched his fingers turn pages. Watched the satisfaction settle into the lines around his eyes like a man who'd finally solved an equation that had been bothering him. 50 pages, he continued. Each one documenting exactly where you exceeded protocol. Termination hearing scheduled for Friday morning. 8 o'clock. You'll want to bring legal representation. The folder landed on the arm of her chair with a soft thud. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said because she understood now that this had never been about one mistake or one protocol violation. This had been inevitable the moment she'd refused to shrink, the moment she'd stood her ground, the moment she'd made him feel small. 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. A hospital lawyer, recommended by the union rep, told her the case was solid but the cards were stacked. His documentation is airtight, the lawyer said. And the incident report, combined with the direct disobedience from the reassignment order, gives them legal cover. Friday morning at 0800, the hospital administrator sat across from her in a conference room with Dr. Pierce at his right elbow like a shark's remora fish. They read the charges. They asked if she had anything to say. She said nothing, because speaking would mean arguing, and arguing would mean justifying, and she would not justify saving a life to people who measured value in liability exposure and departmental prestige. By noon, security was walking her to her locker. She packed her stethoscope, the one with the engraved caduceus she'd bought on her first day at Cedar Creek 3 years ago. She packed the folded flag from her medic, the one who'd taken shrapnel meant for her during a supply run in Tikrit, the one whose name was carved on a memorial wall in Camp Lejeune. She packed a photograph of Miguel in his marine dress blues, his face still soft with 17 years, still unburdened by the weight she'd carried so he wouldn't have to. She packed these things into a cardboard box because the hospital was kind enough to let her leave with dignity. Pierce watched from his office window on the 3rd floor, arms crossed, face satisfied. The automatic doors closed behind her with a hydraulic whisper. The sound echoed in the lobby and she heard it twice, once in her ears and once in her chest. At 0300, she sat in a booth at the Starlight Diner on Victory Drive, the window seat where she could watch the empty street and see her reflection ghost pale against the black glass. Coffee cooled in front of her, untouched for the last hour. The folded flag lay on the table beside the cup, edges sharp as paper cuts, 3 tiny creases holding 20 years of memory in place. The diner hummed with the sound of a refrigerator working too hard. A neon sign buzzed in the window. Outside, rain had started, tapping the glass in irregular rhythm, not quite a pattern, not quite chaos. She looked at her reflection. The woman looking back had hollow cheekbones and bandaged shoulders and eyes that had learned to see in the dark. That woman had held 73 Marines together while the world came apart at the seams. That woman had made decisions that saved lives and cost lives and couldn't tell the difference anymore. That woman was now unemployed in Savannah, Georgia, at 3 in the morning, drinking cold coffee and watching rain. She didn't know that Miguel was awake 2 miles away, going through his closet. She didn't know that her son was holding a shadow box his uncle had given him months ago, kept secret, kept safe, kept waiting for exactly this moment. She didn't know that Commander Hayes was pulling himself upright in his hospital bed, that the general would be landing in Savannah by morning, that 17 Marines whose names were written in her muscle memory were about to become her salvation. She knew only that the rain kept falling. That her coffee kept getting colder. That the flag beside her cup was the only proof she'd ever existed as anything more than this. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent and eternal. 3 days after the attack, security escorted Elena out of Cedar Creek Medical with a cardboard box containing her personal items. A stethoscope. 3 nursing journals. 2 coffee mugs with faded hospital logos. The badge that had granted her access to every corridor, every patient room, every moment of purpose she'd built over 36 months, all rendered meaningless by a document that Dr. Pierce had filed while she bled into the ER bay. The security guard wouldn't meet her eyes. Nobody would. The fluorescent lights of the main corridor bleached everything white as she walked past the vending machines where Pierce had orchestrated his laughter, past the water fountain where she'd steadied herself through 3 years of microaggressions, past the pediatric wing where she'd held a dying 5-year-old's hand while the attending physician took a personal call. Her hidden past remained locked in Pentagon servers, classified under orders that carried a treason penalty if she surfaced, legally non-existent in military records, forbidden from defending herself with the truth that would have incinerated every charge Pierce had leveled. The rain outside was cold and relentless, the kind that hammered the parking lot like applause for a curtain call nobody wanted. At 3 in the morning, Elena sat alone in the Starlight Diner on Victory Drive, the same booth with the torn vinyl seats where she'd hidden for 20 years whenever Savannah felt too small to contain her. Her coffee had gone cold in the reflection of the window, and she watched the steam dissipate like it was leaving her too. The folded flag from her fallen medic, SSGT Maria Reyes, Tikrit, 2019, was tucked into her jacket pocket. That flag was the only proof she'd ever been anything more than this, a fired nurse in scrubs that still smelled like hospital antiseptic and her own dried blood. The ribs still screamed when she shifted position, and the left shoulder felt like someone had replaced the joint with broken glass and regret. A waitress refilled her cup without asking questions. In 12 years of covert operations, 23 years total if you counted the classified years, Elena had learned that people don't ask questions when they see a woman with predator eyes sitting alone at 3 a.m. They just bring more coffee and pretend they didn't see you. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that without the uniform, without the framework of command, without the clear line between operative and civilian, she had no idea who she was anymore. The FBI forensic audit started the next morning, triggered by the federal investigation into the attack on Commander Hayes. When an active duty Marine officer with command authority gets stabbed in a civilian hospital, people ask questions that hospitals can't suppress with liability settlements and cultural silence. The agents pulled every digital file from Cedar Creek's mainframe, every document associated with Elena Martinez's personnel record. Dr. Pierce's edits glowed like neon under metadata analysis. 17 unauthorized accesses over 3 months. Each one carefully timed, usually at 2 a.m. when the network logging wasn't regularly monitored, though it was always there, always timestamp flagged, always speaking in binary about a man who thought he was smarter than accountability. He'd added phantom complaints from patients whose names didn't match any medical records. Backdated disciplinary notes from 3 months before Elena even worked the trauma department. Falsified test scores from nursing certification she'd completed 5 years earlier, adjusting them downward to create a paper trail suggesting chronic incompetence. The technique was sophisticated, the kind of institutional sabotage that only worked because nobody questioned it. Until they did. The agent leading the investigation was a former Navy medic named Holloway, and when he pulled Elena's actual military file from USMC archives, his jaw went slack. 3 layers of security clearance. Combat medic certification. Field surgery credential. Bronze Star commendation. Deployment record redacted in its entirety, marked classified, marked command authority level. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called the Pentagon. By noon, Cedar Creek Medical's legal department knew they were standing on a landmine. When the FBI arrested Pierce, they did it at the hospital during his afternoon rounds. 2 agents in dark suits walked into the intensive care unit where he was standing over a trauma patient, reviewing labs with the kind of granular attention he'd never wasted on Elena. The senior agent, whose name tag read Morrison, placed a hand on Pierce's shoulder and said 4 words that changed the trajectory of every second that followed. Dr. Lawrence Pierce, you're under arrest. The handcuffs clicked shut with the precision of a weapon being chambered, a sound like a closing door, permanent and absolute. Security recorded the entire perp walk down the main corridor, past the vending machines where he'd orchestrated his mockery, past the same pediatric wing where he'd never held a dying child's hand because he saved his human capacities for people who could further his career. The footage made the evening news as a human interest story about workplace vindication, but Elena didn't watch it. She was in a second FBI interview at that moment, finally allowed to tell the truth. Her service record. Her qualifications. The 17 attempts at needle decompression under live enemy fire in Tikrit, which meant she'd actually performed the procedure 340 times more than any resident Pierce had trained. The patient mortality rate in her field surgical teams ran 14% lower than Army baseline, a statistic that made the FBI agent's eyes water because he understood what that meant. She was looking at a legacy written in the bodies of Marines who came home alive instead of flag-draped boxes. The criminal charges against Pierce were filed 48 hours later. Document fraud. Falsification of personnel records. Abuse of authority. Patient endangerment through systematic staff reassignment designed to isolate a medical professional who outperformed his credentials. The medical board hearing took 45 minutes. Dr. Pierce's attorney argued stress, overwork, a dedicated physician who'd gone too far in his pursuit of patient safety, a man whose institutional controls had simply corrected themselves through the natural pressure of his professional conscience. The board chairman, a woman named Dr. Valdez who'd trained field medics for the Army Reserve, spent 45 seconds reviewing the evidence before she rendered her verdict. Your license is revoked permanently, Doctor. Criminal charges will be prosecuted by the federal government. This board recommends maximum penalties. When Pierce tried to speak, Dr. Valdez simply closed the folder. No audience. No applause. Just the sound of institutional consequence closing the door behind him like the weight of something finally, irrevocably over. 6 months later, a private investigator hired by Elena's lawyer found Pierce teaching CPR to bored community college students at Riverside Community College in Jacksonville, 40 miles north of Savannah. $15 an hour. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic training dummy named Annie while 19-year-old nursing assistants scrolled their phones with the kind of active disinterest that only teenagers could weaponize against an instructor they didn't respect. The gymnasium where he taught smelled like old sneakers and institutional anxiety. When the investigator clicked photographs of Pierce going through his demonstration, the muscle memory of medical knowledge stripped of all context and authority, reduced to a technical demonstration for students who would forget him by Friday, Pierce felt the camera. He turned away from the lens, but not before his face showed everything. The collapse. The realization that the institutional power he'd weaponized against Elena had evaporated like sweat under fluorescent lights. His former colleagues didn't return his calls. His name became a case study in medical ethics courses, a cautionary tale whispered during grand rounds, the Pierce incident, when bureaucracy becomes weaponized incompetence. Cedar Creek Medical's new chief of staff circulated a memo about mandatory training on institutional abuse of authority, using his case as the teaching example. His life had become a warning label. Then, 6 months after Pierce's perp walk, Elena stood in dress blues for the first time in 21 years. Not the blues she'd worn in Tikrit under a name that no longer legally existed. Not the dress uniform that had been filed away in classified archives. These were her dress blues, uniform blues that carried the rank of captain in the United States Marine Corps, formally reinstated through a Pentagon process that involved 3 generals and 2 hours of classified briefing that Elena wasn't supposed to remember but would carry in her muscle memory forever. She stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the VA hospital's new trauma wing in downtown Savannah, a facility dedicated to fallen medics and the medical professionals who refused to let any soldier die on their watch. The folded flag that had lived in her hospital locker for 3 years now rested in a memorial case, a display frame of oak and polished glass, her fallen teammate's name engraved on brass below, SSGT Maria Reyes, United States Navy Hospital Corpsman, Tikrit 2019, no one left behind. A matching plaque beside it read, "This facility honors medical professionals who place mission above protocol, duty above self." Miguel stood beside her in marine utilities, dress blues pressed so sharp they could cut glass, fresh from boot camp graduation and already showing the bearing of someone who'd survived something larger than himself. He'd followed the path that nearly destroyed his mother when she thought she'd lost him. He'd become a Marine because he understood now what it meant when she'd taken shrapnel for a man who'd promised to bring him home alive. Commander Hayes, fully recovered except for a scar along his left rib cage that tracked the knife-wound like evidence of Elena's decision to stand between his body and death, addressed the assembled crowd. Captain Martinez performed emergency needle decompression under threat of institutional termination, then sustained 2 stab wounds defending my life when an armed attacker breached our hospital security. She did this knowing with absolute certainty that it would expose the classified identity she'd buried on direct federal order. A ripple moved through the crowd. The truth, finally, allowed into daylight. General Morrison pinned the Meritorious Service Medal to Elena's uniform, the ribbon pale blue with white edges, the medal heavy and absolute. Cedar Creek Medical's new chief of staff, Walsh, the man who'd spent the past 6 months rewriting hospital policy around protecting staff who performed life-saving procedures regardless of bureaucratic scope creep, offered Elena the position of Director of Trauma Services at a salary that made her eyes blink with the shock of someone who'd never expected dignity to come packaged with financial security. She accepted with one condition. "I want to establish a training program for combat medics transitioning to civilian nursing. No questions asked about employment gaps. No background checks beyond standard screening. These people have already been vetted by the Department of Defense. What they need is a pathway home." Walsh nodded before she finished speaking. Her first class had 12 students, all with eyes that had seen too much, a former 75th Ranger Regiment medic who'd lost his right hand and now wore a prosthetic covered in tactical webbing. A Navy hospital corpsman who'd watched 18 Marines die in a single IED blast and had been cycling through civilian hospital jobs for 4 years without finding one that let her operate at the level her training demanded. a combat medic from 160th saw Night Stalkers who'd spent 3 years as a bartender because his trauma made him unemployable in regular med-surg rotation. Elena taught them that the muscle memory of war didn't disappear just because you changed your uniform. It transformed. At the Starlight Diner where she'd hit bottom at 3 a.m., watching her coffee go cold and wondering if she'd ever exist in the light, Elena now sat in the same booth, but Miguel occupied the seat across from her in dress blues that caught the fluorescent overhead light. Commander Hayes occupied the corner table with his wife, a woman with silver eyes who'd learned to love a man who carried a second identity in his nightmares. The waitress brought coffee that stayed hot this time, that didn't evaporate into metaphor and failure. Hayes raised his mug in silent salute, the kind of greeting that required no words, only the mutual understanding that survival meant something when the right people were standing witness. Elena nodded in return, and Miguel grinned with the brightness of a 19-year-old who finally understood why his mother had always been stronger than she looked. "Mom, you're gonna be late for your shift," Miguel said, checking his watch. 0315, Elena's watch read the same time. Morning coming in like an operation already in progress, like something worth moving toward. "Then let's move, Marine," she said. They stood together as the diner's television played the morning news feed. Cedar Creek Medical received the Joint Commission Excellence Award for Trauma Care Innovation and Staff Retention Protocol Development. The banner across the screen read, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Elena didn't look at the screen. She was already walking toward the door, her son beside her, her uniform catching the edge of something that finally looked like the beginning of a new life instead of the end of an old one. The rain had stopped. The morning smelled like salt water and possibility. Behind her, Hayes and his wife stood as they passed, a small gesture of respect between soldiers who'd learned to measure courage in different units. The door chimed as they left. Outside, Savannah was waking up to a woman who finally existed in the light, both halves of her life now visible, finally allowed to occupy the same space without shame or secrets. That's when the waitress whispered to no one in particular, she was one of them all along, wasn't she? And Hayes, gathering his jacket, simply smiled and said, "Worse. She was always the best one in the room. We just finally started looking." If Elena Martinez's story taught us anything, it's that the quietest person in uniform might be the one holding everything together. Subscribe to see more stories about the warriors we pass without seeing, the heroes we miss because we're looking in the wrong direction. What would you have done in Elena's position? Would you have let the flag stay buried, or would you have fought to bring it into the light? Let me know in the comments below.